Hey everybody, Mikki here. You're listening to Wikipedia, and this week on the podcast, I speak to Dr. Matt Nagra, a naturopathic doctor and researcher known for his evidence-based perspective on nutrition with a particular focus on plant-based diets and chronic disease. In this episode, the conversation tackles one of the most debated topics in nutrition right now, protein, and Matt helps unpack why protein has become such a focal point, how to interpret the current evidence from his perspective, and what outcomes actually matter when we're talking about intake and health. So we do also explore the RDA briefly and what it was designed to represent, and just his thoughts on the shift in the current recommendations. We also discuss protein quality, addressing common claims around plant versus animal protein, and why mechanistic research doesn't always align with long-term health outcomes. Matt also provides important context around dietary patterns and chronic disease risk, helping to separate the role of protein itself from the broader way that people eat. And then we finish off with a dive into choline, covering its role in the body, how it interacts with other nutrients like folate and betaine, and what this means for people following predominantly plant-based diets. And we discuss choline because it illustrates what we think we know about nutrients and plant-based diets, but what research actually shows and intakes actually show us. And I really enjoyed this opportunity to chat to someone whose views are just vastly different from mine and just get a better understanding of a different perspective, basically. So Dr. Matt Nagra is a naturopathic doctor who graduated from the Boucher Institute after completing a Bachelor of Science in microbiology at the University of Victoria. He holds additional board certifications in prescriptive authority, immunizations, advanced injection therapies, intravenous therapies, and acupuncture. Using an evidence-based approach, he creates individualized treatment protocols tailored to each patient's health goals and lifestyle. He has a particular passion for plant-based and vegan nutrition, physical medicine, and chronic disease treatment. His work aims to support individuals in thriving on plant-based diets while bridging the gap between lifestyle-based interventions and medical care. And I have links as to where you can find Matt over on his website, on Instagram, where he shares a lot of really great information for free, and also a link to the choline paper that he and I discuss today. Before we crack on into the interview, though, I would like to remind you that the best way to support this podcast is to hit the subscribe button on your favorite podcast listening platform. That increases the visibility of Wikipedia in amongst literally thousands of other podcasts out there, so more people get to hear from the experts I have on the show, like Dr. Matt Nagra. All right, guys, enjoy the conversation.
Honestly, I don't know, I wake up probably 6 or 7 and up till 10 or 11, I don't know.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I don't know.
So.
Some people are typically one or the other. I'm definitely an early morning person, so it almost doesn't even matter what time I get up. It's going to be dark anyway. So
yeah, it'll be weird in the winter for it to be dark till 9 a.m. or something, but whatever.
We'll see how that pans out. Matt, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me this morning. I heard you on Signal Nutrition with my good friend Eric Helms, having a good old chat about protein and in the context of both health and performance, which I thought it would be really great to chat to you about, because you'll have a different perspective from a lot of people I speak to because of your plant. I think you're plant-based. So, and I'm not, which it doesn't matter. But what I was thinking when I was listening to the podcast was, it would be great to talk to you because of that perspective, because I think that it will give people just a little bit more insights into some of the information that is out there. And then, of course, on the podcast, you also, and I'll link the podcast to anyone who is interested, and I'm sure a lot of people will, you mentioned about micronutrients and particularly choline, which is something I've not had the pleasure of chatting to anyone about. So I thought we could also dive into that this morning.
Sounds good.
Great stuff, Matt. So I'd just love to get your perspective, actually, across the course of your years of, education and clinical work, the conversation with protein has probably changed quite a bit. And I'm interested in your perspective, particularly from maybe Canada is different from the States as well. Why do you think this has become such a big topic?
Well, it's interesting. I feel like it's always been a big topic, and I mean, even if you look at Google Trends data, it's one of those things that's always kind of sat above the rest, and it has only increased. So it was like already a big topic. Now it's an even bigger topic. But also in the plant-based space, there was a lot of talk around like, oh, low protein's the way to go, or like moderate protein, or not so much the high protein. And then that seemed to have shifted in recent years to more of the high protein. So even though protein was a topic of discussion, the sort of narrative around it has changed a bit. So yeah, as far as like why, I honestly don't know what led to all of this. Obviously, there's a lot of focus on fitness. There's a lot of, I think, podcasts that have really taken off. Obviously, we have things like Rogan, Huberman, et cetera, that talk a lot about protein. And maybe that has helped it sort of enter the zeitgeist a bit more and really, led people to wanting, protein everything. I mean, nowadays you go in and you find, cereals that are supplemented with protein, which I think is a great thing. But like, I don't know that we saw that so much 10 years ago.
Yeah, it's interesting. And of course, with the change in the dietary guidelines from the US, typically what I've noticed is that they almost, even though that is just US based, often a lot of the other countries, if you like, or sort of follow suit. Do you think that's going to happen in Canada this time around?
I'm not sure. I do like the little bit more emphasis on protein. The funny thing is the protein recommendation of 1.2 grams per kilogram that they gave, that's kind of the average intake in the US anyway. It's already around that. So it's like, I don't know how much it's going to change. But what's interesting is there are actually a few countries in Europe. I can't recall. I know I mentioned them in the Sigma episode. I can't recall all of them right now, but have actually been recommending higher protein intakes around 1.2, et cetera, per gram per kilogram, particularly for older individuals. And so there were some that were ahead of the US in that department.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think Brazil, maybe 10 years ago, came out with their real food guidelines. I recall that. And in fact, I was just speaking to Professor Don Lehman earlier this morning because him and Heather Leihart, I think her name is, were the ones that sort of reviewed and made the recommendations for the dietary guidelines around protein. I'm interested in terms of this, because it came under this current administration, how sticky these are going to be sort of moving forward and what happens. But I guess time will tell from that perspective anyway.
Yeah, we'll have to wait 5 years till the next guidelines and see what carries over.
Yeah, totally. And of course, a lot of the discussion around protein is around protein quality and protein diets. And particularly on social media, you'll get a lot of the debate that there's animal protein is, from a mechanistic perspective, it's much more bioavailable. People need it. Whereas, of course, we've got like whole populations who are vegetarian. We've got people who are very healthy who are vegetarians. So how do we, when we're looking at, I guess, protein intake, and health, I suppose, first, and I'm interested in your performance perspective as well. How should we think about it? And what should we care about most? What are your thoughts?
Well, I mean, there is two sort of, I guess, angles that we can take it from. One is obviously the performance, which you said we'll touch on soon, and what is sort of optimal there. And then there's the health outcomes. And that's usually like what I'm discussing with a lot of my patients. I mean, I see a lot of people who are struggling with cardiometabolic disease, whether that's type 2 diabetes or prediabetes, or maybe it's cardiovascular disease or something in that realm. And so for those individuals, I'm really focusing on the health impacts. And in those cases, I mean, when we look at substitution analyses, even when we look at randomized controlled trials and intermediate markers, we see that replacing animal proteins with plant proteins tends to be beneficial. And it's not like you need to absolutely make a wholesale swap. We could be talking a serving or two a day, and that makes a significant impact. But having a little bit of a shift that way, because people are already consuming a lot of animal protein. It's the fact that not a lot of people are eating things like beans and tofu and those sorts of things that can obviously have a lot of benefit.
Yeah, and I feel like nutrition is rife with the reductionist view when it comes to thinking about diet. Like it's just this one thing in the diet that we need to sort of optimize or change. Whereas to your point, just making shifts can change a whole number of micronutrients, fiber, etc., not necessarily making a huge, or it doesn't necessarily mean everyone needs to go completely plant-based. Or, yeah, I guess that's the thing with nutrition, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of nuance, and I think we see on all sides of the ledger. Like we have people in the plant-based camp who will say, any amount of animal protein causes cancer, and then we'll have people on the other side saying that beans contain lectins, and that's going to cause toxicity or whatever. And this is the part that I think gets underappreciated or just not considered, is that then there's people in the middle. There are people who say are omnivorous, like to include animal proteins in their diet, and they will have a bias for that. And I think that's what people miss, is that you can absolutely have a bias for the middle. And so, I see that a lot of times when, I might cite data suggesting, hey, you know what, replacing a serving of red meat with plant protein per day is beneficial. Or, I might talk about red meat consumption in colorectal cancer or something like that. And you'll have some of those individuals in the middle suggesting suggesting that the data isn't particularly strong or coming up with reasoning for that. And they'll often do it under this guise of, well, I eat both, so I'm not biased, when your bias could be for including a little bit of everything. And so I think that's important to consider here.
Yeah, no, I really like that. One of the I guess the common things which people talk about is that plant proteins are lower quality than animal protein from a bioavailability perspective, an amino acid profile perspective. Can you give me your perspective really on sort of protein? What do we mean when we say sort of low quality? And then what does the data that really count, what does that actually say?
So quality sort of depends on how you define it. There are a lot of different scoring systems out there. I guess I'll just touch on the amino acid argument really quick, and then I'll dive into like the two main scoring systems that are brought up. So with amino acid profiles, there are 9 essential amino acids, the building blocks of protein that we need to consume in our diet. We don't make them. And some will claim that plants don't contain all of them, or they're missing some. That's wholly untrue. All plants contain all of the 9 essential amino acids. However, they are in varying proportions. That means that beans might have more of certain amino acids, less of others. Grains might have more of those ones that beans are lacking, and vice versa. And as long as you're eating some variety in your day, that's really not an issue. Where it would become an issue is if you were literally eating one food group as your entire diet, and just nobody's recommending that. So it's just really a non-issue from the get-go. Now, with protein quality, the 2 scores that are typically referenced are the protein digestibility corrected amino acid score, PDCAS, and the newer one, which is the digestible indispensable amino acid score, or the DIAS. Now, starting with the PDCAS, essentially what they do is they'll feed proteins or feed foods, sometimes isolated proteins, but otherwise foods, to mostly rodent models, and they'll measure how much protein goes in one end and how much comes out the other end. Now, the percentage that was absorbed is whatever is missing there, right? And whatever didn't make it all the way through. And so they'll take that, and then they'll go a little bit further. They don't just look at the percentage of protein that was absorbed, but they look at whatever the limiting amino acid was. So again, with the example of beans that might be lacking in a specific amino acid, if let's say, for sake of argument, I'm going to make up numbers here just to help illustrate a point. Let's say it provided 100% of your needs for 8 of the 9 amino acids, but only 50% of the other one. And then let's say you absorb, I don't know, we'll say 80% of the protein. Well, you would get a score of 40 out of 100. That's because the least available amino acid only provided 50% of your needs, or whatever the comparison is, and you only absorbed 80% of that, which is actually pretty good absorption. But 80% of 50 is 40. And so you'll get scored 40 even though you absorb 80% of the protein. That's like, and I often use this comparison, it's like if you had a report card, and let's say you had 9 subjects, and you got straight A's on 8 of them, and then you got like a C on the 9th one. And then your report card, all it would read is C. It's the only grade you take home. You don't see the A's, you don't average them out or anything like that. That's sort of how that scoring system works. So it's not really just a measure of digestibility. In fact, digestibility is a pretty small component of that scoring system. And it becomes largely irrelevant when you're eating a diet comprised of more than one food group, because you're going to have other foods compensating for that amino acid that it's a bit lower in. Now, from there, we can move on to the dias. It's more or less the same with a few small differences. So for one, most commonly tested in pig models. And instead of measuring digestion through the entire digestive tract, they actually insert a tube into the end of the small intestine, and they'll measure absorption from the mouth to the ileum, the end of the small intestine. And that's because some of the microbes in the colon might break down some of the proteins, and so you don't want to have that skewing the results. And another limitation to the dias is that they often use raw foods, so even like raw grains and raw beans, which can reduce digestibility. And finally, the same issue applies that we had with the PDCAS score. They don't just rate based on digestibility, they rate on the amount of the lowest amino acid or the limiting amino acid in there. Once again, making it largely irrelevant to diets comprised of multiple food groups that are a little bit more well balanced. And that's not to necessarily criticize the scoring systems. They are designed or primarily used for places for dietary assessments in places where there is poor food security. There's a lot of insecurity. And in those cases, hey, you might be eating mostly one or two foods. And obviously it becomes more important there. But that is not necessarily important to the discussion of people listening to this podcast and maybe trying to make decisions of what they should be purchasing at the grocery store, or how they want to make their dinner tonight, or what have you. And so both scoring systems are okay if they're used in a very specific context, but they're often used outside of that context, and that's where it becomes problematic.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. And it's interesting, isn't it? Because there are and again, like I was talking about nutrition being quite reductionist, to your point about how, we hear these things like the different scoring systems for amino acids, and people, again, don't understand the context with which that they should be used. They're just very broadly used and referenced across the board.
Yeah, 100%. And actually, when we look at what's called true ileal digestibility, which just measures the entire protein digestibility from mouth to ileum, we see that plant proteins do pretty well. If we use even modestly processed plant-based foods, things like tofu, soy milk, seitan, et cetera, it's like mid to high 90s. If we look at plant-based meats, it's high 90s, or at least mid 90s. That's about what you get with beef or like other animal proteins. If you look at legumes, you're typically around 80% or so, give or take. Some even reach around 90%. And so it's really good. We're talking very small differences between most of these plant protein sources and animal sources. So the differences in digestibility are largely overstated when we're using things like the PDCAS or the DIAS.
Yeah. And that is crazy to me that they look at raw beans and like uncooked grains, like nobody eats like that. Like, yeah. And Stephen Gundry put out the book. You mentioned lectins.
Lectins,
yeah. And people just went, and maybe it's just the circles with which I'm in because it is very nutrition focused. It's what I do. People went very crazy over the idea that suddenly all of their dietary issues were related to this one thing that we're not really getting a lot of in our diet anyway. Like nutrition's rife with that.
Yeah, I mean, it's like when carnivores say that vegetables are toxic and causing issues at a population scale, when in reality people aren't consuming many vegetables. Unfortunately, it can't really be driving all this chronic disease when we're not eating them. So
yeah, and I do feel that there's a lot of focus on plant-based versus omnivore versus carnivore, etc. And we miss a lot of the real issues with diet, which ultra-processed foods, hyperpalatable, people are eating too many of them and too few micronutrients. I don't know. I imagine you see the same thing, Matt, in your work.
Yeah, and I think actually I think even ultra-processed foods to a degree become a scapegoat. And that's because not all ultra-processed foods are going to be problematic. There's so much variability there. There's, whole grain breads and cereals, which are consistently beneficial across the board. But then there's, processed meats, there's sodas, there's donuts. All of these things can affect our health in different ways. Heck, fortified plant-based milks could be considered, even soy milk could be considered ultra-processed. Certain types of tofu, especially if it's like a flavored tofu, like smoked tofu, which I like to consume, it's considered ultra-processed. It's like, I don't know, we need to, I don't know what the answer is. It's certainly above my pay grade, but I think we need a way to maybe score foods a little more broadly or something. Like I actually really like when I'm traveling over in Europe, you'll see like the Nutri-Score grades based on like sodium content, saturated fat content, added sugar content, et cetera. Like that actually seems more reasonable, to base it on the sort of composition of the food rather than, oh, hey, it falls into this camp of ultra processed or it falls into this camp of whatever. And that sort of dictates, how we should consider it as far as health value.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And I also think looking at overall dietary patterns, and I think that you'll agree, like that thinking about what people eat overall and I guess the energy balance of that plays a huge role in terms of health outcomes.
Yeah, so energy balance is massive, and you're right, the diet quality plays a huge role. So something that, and I always say this, but I feel like some of the me being vegan myself, a lot of my vegan followers don't like when I bring this up, but I think the foundations of a healthy diet are pretty clear. I mean, that's extremely consistent. We have so much data on it. We have obviously whole grains, we got fruits and veggies, we got nuts and seeds, we got legumes, and if you're plant-based, awesome. Those are your foundational foods. And then if you're including animal proteins, things like fermented and low-fat dairy, things like fish, those can fit in regularly. Now, other foods, like you can have some room for myself, maybe the occasional vegan ice cream or something, or if you wanted to have a little bit of meats here and there, and still have a healthy overall diet, fine. But are you having a steak every single day? Are you having these donuts every single day or ice cream every single day? Like that's where it becomes potentially problematic.
One of the big things which I think most people don't consider when they're sort of overwhelmed with the diet information is, how much are you moving actually? Like, what's your physical activity like? Like, I'm a huge proponent of if everyone literally just moved a bit more, probably a lot of the dietary factors would be much less of an issue than what they currently are.
I mean, I think it's reasonable to say that exercise is a huge component. I don't know if it completely compensates for diet quality. I mean, I wouldn't say it compensates for diet quality. I would say both are beneficial, right? So like if you move from like being super sedentary to regularly active, even if we're talking going for a 45-minute walk or something on a regular basis, like that's a step in the right direction. Obviously, if it's something a little bit more intense, even better. Versus making small changes like increasing fiber intake by 10 grams a day or something. Like there's so many different markers that we can look at. I think those can both be really beneficial changes, but I wouldn't necessarily say that like if you're exercising a bit more, that all of a sudden diet doesn't matter. And I'm not saying that you were suggesting that, but like I would weigh them both as important. And I think there's multiple levers there to pull.
I agree. And I guess just to clarify, I think we place so much emphasis on these, like the minutiae of diet, not that what we're talking about is minutiae, that actually we do forget a lot of other aspects of health. Or like a lot of the people arguing, actually, they should go out and do a little bit more exercise because they're not necessarily the most active bunch, I guess.
Yeah. And I wonder, I'm just spitballing here, but I wonder if that's in part because everybody sort of agrees that exercise is good for us. Like it's not something that's really like, I think the reason that diet gets talked about so much is that there are so many opinions and everybody disagrees. And so it is obviously a huge talking point. And then obviously you have the dietary guidelines. It's almost like politicization of the whole thing. Like I wonder if that's really explaining the difference there, because I think everybody knows movement is important. It's just, I wonder if it's more of having the time or, having access. Obviously, there are certain things you can do without gyms and whatnot, but that could be costly for a lot of people, of course, as well, or getting equipment for home or whatever. Like I wonder if there's other variables at play that are maybe roadblocks, right, rather than it being sort of something that nobody's thinking about.
No, that's such a good point, actually. Everyone eats, everyone has an opinion, whereas you're right, everyone knows you should be moving. The fact that a lot of people aren't is almost like it's not even really part of the conversation. Matt, outside of obviously the macronutrients, micronutrients are a huge piece of the puzzle. And when I saw that you wrote your paper on choline, I thought that would be the paper was great. And I'm interested, what motivated you to sort of go down that route of looking at specific micronutrients?
Yeah, so I've actually written a few papers on different micronutrients. Choline was one of the most recent ones. And it usually stems from things that come up in conversation that I have with patients or with family or friends or social media comments, just areas that people are really confused about. And again, being plant-based myself and having that audience, it's usually nutrients that are brought up in that context. Obviously, choline is a big one that gets brought up. Now, my co-author, David Goldman, is very much the same. Basically, when he answers a question enough times about a specific nutrient, he's like, screw it, I'm going to write a paper on it because,
Yeah, yeah.
then I can be like, hey, here, read this, versus having to explain yourself every time. So that's really where it came from. And I don't think it's out yet. We have one on taurine as well. I don't think it's actually been published yet. So like, we're just cranking them out as they come.
Yeah, yeah, no, that's awesome. So can we chat about choline then? What is it? What is the main role in the body, and why is it that that it's a micronutrient of concern, if you like?
Yeah, so it's a specific type of vitamin. It plays a critical role in neurotransmitter synthesis. It's a precursor to acetylcholine, which maybe people have heard of, important for memory, nerve signal transmission, muscle control, etc. And it's also a precursor for phosphatidylcholine. I almost said phosphatidylserine there,
Yeah.
choline. And this is required to form and secrete VLDLs from the liver. So if you don't have enough of that, you can have fats building up in the liver, and it can cause non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, or MAFLD now. It's changed its name. Metabolic associated steatotic liver disease, I believe.
Yeah,
MASLD. Yeah. And it can also, this sort of plays into, the requirements and how they may change for some people, but it can also be oxidized into betaine in the liver, which then is a methyl donor. So it can donate a methyl group to homocysteine, which can then go on to form methionine and so on. So it plays a number of different roles. And so, in theory, deficiency could result in a number of different types of outcomes, memory issues, liver disease, et cetera.
And so are there populations at risk of deficiency? Like, where do we get choline?
Yeah, so choline, it can be found in the diet. There are some of the richest sources are things like beef liver or eggs. And so those are often talked about. Mind you, you have to eat a fair bit of beef liver to the point that getting too much vitamin A might be an issue if you're doing it really often. And, so something to consider. But eggs being one of the main dietary sources. But then there are some plant sources with a decent amount, even similar or more than regular beef or chicken. And these are things like tofu, soy milk, lentils, chickpeas, Brussels sprouts, broccoli. So there's a number of sources that provide per serving, north of 10% of the daily value. It's a matter of consuming those regularly enough that becomes an issue. Now, there are certain populations in which we see that intake might be a concern. And I say that based on trials showing actually improvements in outcome when you're supplementing. And those are things like pregnancy in particular being one of the main ones. When we look at adverse pregnancy related outcomes, there's a lower risk of outcomes with supplementation, but this is typically relatively high doses that you aren't going to achieve through most dietary practices. Outside of that, it's interesting because the majority of people end up falling below what's considered the adequate intake for choline right now. So whether you're an omnivore, vegetarian, or vegan, you're typically falling well below the adequate intake. And so that's where this discussion of, do we have it right with where the current level is set, or does that need to be modified down? Is it super conservative? And that's a lot of what we discuss in that paper.
Yeah, and adequate intake values they're different from they're almost a substitute for the RDAs, right? Or the EARs, the estimated average requirements, because we don't have the data to suggest one way or the other.
Yeah, exactly. It's sort of an estimate. It's like a very conservative estimate to just cover your bases. And so where it largely stems from is back in I think it was 91, there was a trial that sort of led people to thinking choline was important, where they had people on two different diets. There was a choline-rich diet, which, if I recall, was around 550 milligrams, maybe 500 milligrams, somewhere in that ballpark. And then there was a low choline diet, which was around 50 milligrams or so. And they found that those on the low choline diet actually wound up having some of those issues that I mentioned earlier related to choline deficiency, things like liver disease and so on. And so that suggested that, okay, 500-ish is enough, but 50 is not enough. And so they set the bar at 500. Now, where the true bar should be set is probably in between those two extremes, but they're going to play it conservative and set it at the higher value. Now, one of the reasons that I suspect that is ultra conservative is the fact that, like I mentioned earlier, most people fall well below the adequate intake, yet deficiency is very rare. At least like known overt deficiency is extremely rare. And so that suggests that it's somewhere lower, but we just don't have the research to really pinpoint where that should be put. At the same time, requirements can vary depending on the rest of the diet, which further complicates things.
Yeah, and can you explain that a little bit more? Like how would the rest of the diet change the amount of choline that we have?
Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, choline can be oxidized to betaine, and betaine plays a role as a methyl donor. And so if you're consuming betaine, which is much richer in a number of plant foods, I believe nuts being one of the main sources, that can lower your requirement for choline because you don't need choline to do that job anymore. Also, folate serves as the methyl donor for homocysteine. So the more folate you have, which is super rich in grains and greens, or beans and greens, I should say, then you need less choline for that purpose as well. So like there are other factors like the betaine and folate that can sort of compensate for the choline. And so that just complicates things a little bit when it comes to determining exactly how much you need.
Yeah, and isn't it interesting, like, just to sort of go into the weeds on something like this a little bit, people will get an appreciation that, focusing on just one thing in your diet is missing the forest for the trees a little bit, because there are so many other factors which influence the overall sort of health outcomes a diet's going to provide.
Yeah, and this is why in the paper as well, we really focus on outcomes. Again, we were talking mostly about whether choline is a nutrient of concern for vegans or vegetarians. And when we look at those plant-based diets and things like liver-related diseases or cognitive outcomes, we don't really see worse outcomes. If anything, especially with liver, we see better or improvements in certain liver markers. And so that suggests that even if you are consuming less choline, which presumably you would be on a plant-based diet if you're not consuming things like eggs with regularity, well, then you should see worse outcomes. But clearly there's more to it than just choline intake.
Yeah, for sure. And Matt, as you noted, you've written a few papers on micronutrients. Is this something that you see across the board when you're looking at specific, like when you're like just dialing down on one micronutrient? Are you sort of, when you step back, is this the sort of pattern and picture that you get?
Sort of. I mean, I think choline's interesting because it is technically an essential nutrient, but as I mentioned, like the amounts can vary depending on a number of factors. When we look at a lot of other nutrients that are brought up, things like taurine or carnitine, like these are non-essential nutrients. These are things that like maybe in certain contexts, they might have like performance benefits athletically or whatever, but it's not necessary to prevent deficiency. And then when we look at things like vitamin K2 is, I think, a fantastic example where there's just a lot of confusion. With K2, there's two main forms. There's MK4 and MK7. Now, MK7 is the type you'll find in a lot of fermented foods, particularly fermented soybean called natto. That's the richest source. MK4 is the kind you'll find in things like meats. And a lot of what a lot of people in the carnivore space will say is, vegans aren't getting a lot of this K2, or they aren't perhaps getting any K2, depending on their diet, and therefore they're going to end up deficient. Well, our body makes K2, we consume plenty of K1, and the type of K2 in the animal foods, that MK4, isn't even bioavailable at dietary sources. You don't even absorb it at the doses found in diet. And so it's another one of those issues of like on the surface, it might seem obvious, like, oh, this contains that nutrient, therefore we're getting all of that. When in reality, when you dig a little bit deeper, it's like, oh, actually you aren't absorbing it in that form from those foods. You need higher doses, et cetera. And it's not exactly like what we're seeing with choline, but it's just one of those things where once you dive in a little bit, it seems that people are putting a little bit too much stock into these specific claims.
Yeah. And Matt, clearly as a plant-based naturopath, you must talk to people all of the time about their diets. What are the major considerations that you see that people who do want to be plant-based, what should they focus on? It's because I've spoken to a lot of omnivore practitioners about what they think the emphasis should be on for people who are plant-based, and I'm curious as to how that might how it might differ.
Yeah, I think there's certain micronutrients that we need to focus on. Obviously, having a source of B12 in there. I prefer supplements as being a really cheap and easy and reliable option. Obviously, you could do fortified foods as well. It's just you need to be very consistent with it. I think it becomes a little bit trickier, or at least requires a little bit more focus. Depending on where you are, like I'm here in Canada, so typically supplement vitamin D, just because you're not getting a ton of sun exposure. And then potentially, depending, this is where it gets into sort of really individual, but if you aren't using an iodized salt, for example, maybe considering an iodine supplement. And like I'll go through people's diet to consider those things. Now, when we get outside of that to macronutrients, I do place a little bit more emphasis on protein. Like I'm sure you've spoken to with many people, and we mentioned earlier, I do think aiming higher than the RDA, like 1.2 grams per kilogram or so, is reasonable. I think if we're talking about performance, going even higher to at least 1.6 grams per kilogram, if you're looking to squeeze out every last drop. Some people don't necessarily care about that, but if you're really wanting to maximize gains, I think that's reasonable. And that does require a little bit of focus, focusing on things like lentil-based pastas, which are sort of a hack in many ways for protein. Consuming seitan potentially is a really rich protein source, comparable to even lean meats. Tofu is obviously a great source. Soy curls are excellent sources. Lentils can be pretty good sources. Like there's a lot of things that I'll try to focus on as for sort of being a mainstay in one's diet, a foundational component, let's say. Whereas like on the flip side, and because I do work with omnivores as well, I don't just work with people who are plant-based. On the flip side, it's usually more focused on, okay, how do we limit saturated fat intake so you're not going crazy there? How do we boost up your fiber intake to a degree? If you are consuming foods that are typically associated with risk, things like processed meats and so on, let's limit those. What are alternatives? Maybe you switch to a plant-based meat product for those, because we do have data showing improvements in like cardiovascular risk factors by making that swap. And so we'll find ways to sort of navigate different nutrients in that case.
Yeah. And what are some of the mistakes people often make, if you see them, if they're wanting to, let's say, change from an omnivore approach to a plant-based approach, or just people who generally sort of come to see you?
I think if people are switching from an omnivorous diet to a plant-based one, one of the big issues is low calorie intake. So you can actually end up with, like, obviously that can have its benefits in a certain context, but sometimes it can really take a dive, especially if you're swapping out from a lot of fatty meats and full fat milks and things like that to like really low calorie options, almond milk, for example, and instead of the meats, maybe you're replacing them with low protein, low calorie density, like using jackfruit as a replacement for meat, which has a really nice meaty texture, but at the same time, you don't want that to be your main protein source, and it's certainly not going to be very calorie dense. Maybe you drop your calorie intake too much too fast and you feel weak and you're losing weight really quick. Maybe you're an athlete and you're concerned about that. Those are the types of things that I think need to be discussed, but I think that's really easy to cover. It's just like, hey, let's make sure that we're having protein rich, more calorie dense options with your meals. I'll look at what people were consuming prior and find what would suitable alternatives be. I don't like people to just be making a wholesale change. If somebody typically uses, or let's say makes pasta with like a bolognese sauce, I'm like, okay, well, let's make sure the pasta's plant-based if that's what you're going for, and then let's swap out the meaty component for, maybe you want lentils in there, or maybe you want like a plant-based veggie grounds or something that's going to be high protein as well. Those types of changes, I think, are a lot more easy to make, and you don't really have to learn how to cook new things. You essentially prepare them in much the same way. So those are the types of things I look at.
Yeah. Do we need to consider the quality of the plant-based processed meats and things like that? Like, because I'm always mindful of that when I'm talking to people. Like, I wouldn't want, if people are concerned about diet quality, like, is this something that we need to be worried about?
It can be. So actually, I published a paper on this in the Canadian Journal of Cardiology about 2 years ago now. As a review on plant-based meats and looking at the trials, comparing them to the animal-based counterparts. And we actually see on average that you still get reductions in LDL cholesterol. You don't see a rise in blood pressure despite the high sodium content, interestingly, of a lot of the plant-based meats. And so it does seem on average to be a good swap, but it does sort of depend on what you're comparing. Like, for example, I could see a world where you compare an extra lean cut of meat to like an Impossible Burger that's rich in coconut oil and relatively high. Like I could see that actually increasing LDL, if you were to sort of pick specific comparators. But that said, I like to look for options, one, that are a good source of protein. So again, if you want, a jackfruit pulled pork type thing, fine, do that once in a while, but I wouldn't make that a mainstay. So I'd look at protein content. I'd make sure it's low in saturated fat, ideally. And then I'd look at sodium content as well. And if you can get one that's around, 300 milligrams or so, maybe less per serving, that's excellent. But you'll find some products that are 600-700 milligrams per serving. You'll see some that are over 1,000 milligrams per serving. So it can vary quite a bit. So those are the types of things that I would look at. And there's fortunately a lot of brands nowadays that actually have like high protein, low saturated fat, low sodium options, as there's been more of a shift or more of a focus on making them healthier. So people will use a mix of maybe the regular salt, but with like a potassium-based component to compensate for some of the sodium or whatever. So they'll find ways to lower the sodium content.
Yeah. And I guess much as I talk to people about how they choose to eat their meat, is that like if you've got an abundance of vegetables on your plate as well, then that's going to cover a lot of these sort of health related outcomes that we're really concerned about as well.
I mean, yeah, I think most people can benefit from increasing vegetable intake. I don't think that's any secret. But I mean, that goes for fruits, it goes for whole grains, it goes for nuts. Like there's all of these food groups can, bring some benefit. But definitely I would say incorporating veggies as a mainstay in the diet is going to be really important.
Yeah. Anything on the social media front, Matt, that sort of grinds your gears? Like, what do you come up against that might make you roll your eyes on I've seen you actually do a few takedown videos on a few things, which a lot of people are getting into.
I don't know. I mean, there's a lot that grinds my gears, I feel like, out there. You'll see me make a video on most of them. I think one of the ones, and I talked about this earlier, one of the ones that really drives me nuts is this idea that people who aren't vegan or aren't carnivore are unbiased. Drives me nuts because I get that all the time. I get that so much whenever I respond to somebody who's kind of viewed in that middle space. That you'll just get comments, oh, but you're vegan and he's not or she's not. Therefore, like okay, as if that, like, engage with what I said. Tell me where I was wrong, or let's have that discussion. But I find it's a really hard one to get through to people, that like you can be biased in the middle. It's very hard for people to grasp that. Yeah. So that's one that maybe grinds my gears a bit.
Yeah, and I guess it's I mean, it's almost part of just being human is having the bias. You can't help it. So the idea that anyone is sort of free from that is a little bit crazy, to be honest.
Yeah. And that's what I always say. I was like, look, everybody has a bias. I have a bias, but look, me as a quote unquote biased vegan, like I have no problem saying that, as I did earlier, certain types of dairy products, fish, like these can be a part of a healthy diet. I have no problem saying that from a health perspective. Of course, I take ethical issues with both of those things for other reasons. But I'm not going to let that cloud how I talk about the science. I want to be objective in that realm. And so I think that's about all I could say to convince somebody that I am not biased. If they still think I am too biased to evaluate the science after that, I just don't think there's anything I can really say to change their mind.
No, I agree. And to be fair, I don't think we can do a lot to change a lot of people's mind, like on social media. Like I think having the different perspectives is really helpful. And over time, people can change their mind, but we're never going to do it on, one video on social media, really. Yeah.
I agree.
Matt, I really appreciate your time, and I really like the stuff that you put on social media. I don't agree with all of it, but I mean, that's what makes the world go round.
Let's talk about it. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And, but I do really like listening to your perspective because, different perspectives are really helpful. Can you let people know where they can find you on social media, and also as a clinician, like, do you see people outside of Canada? Like what's the go there?
Yeah. So as far as social media, I'm definitely most active on Instagram, but I do post across platforms. Just Instagram's where I have my biggest following. So as far as responding to stuff, it's usually there. On YouTube, TikTok, Twitter, X, whatever, all of that. And the comments on TikTok are crazy. But anyways, so I'm there. Also have some links in my bio as far as like going to my direct website, some like downloadables, some podcast episodes I've been on, all that kind of stuff. And then I also, I can't remember what the last question was you asked, actually.
Yeah, no, it's where do people find out more about you and also your clinical work as well.
Oh, yeah, clinical. Yeah, that's what you said. Yeah. So as far as clinical practice, I work in Vancouver, BC. I see people via telemedicine across BC, but unfortunately can't see people outside of the province of BC. So have to be within BC in order for me to work with you. But if that's you, send me a message and we can see if we can figure it out.
I love it, Matt. Well, thank you so much for your time this morning. I really appreciate it because I know that you are busy. And I think that you've given people just a few things to think about in terms of their own belief systems around what is healthy from a plant-based perspective versus meat, and just some of those other considerations. And particularly, I was good to use choline as a reference nutrient for some of these other aspects of diet that we should consider. So thanks so much, Matt. I appreciated it.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. I don't think I've really talked about choline too much on a podcast, so first time.
Great stuff. All right, see you later. Alrighty, hopefully you enjoyed that. Nat was super fun to chat to, and as I said, he's got such a wealth of information. We have different perspectives on diet for health, and I love the opportunity to chat to someone and the opportunity to be, I guess, a little more open-minded about some of my recommendations. So hopefully you enjoyed that. And next week on the podcast, I speak to one of my business colleagues, physical therapist, Dr. Melissa Kale, on hypermobility and EDS. That is next week. Until then, though, you can find me over on Instagram, Threads, and X at Mikki Williden, Facebook at Mikki Williden Nutrition, or head to my website, mikkywilliden.com, book a one-on-one call with me. All right, guys, you have the best week. See you later.